And I just want to mention Barry. And when you're going to talk about Barry Schwartz at all? So, I just want to mention that. So Barry Schwartz, God rest his soul, he's part of our documentary that we did. And man, I'm telling you, this little guy, he's just Jewish hippie. That's how I described him. And he was just engaging. We took her out to Colorado to interview him out there when we were there. And this guy was just incredible. He's one of the official photographers in 1978 on the Stir Project. And he passed away in 2024. And Barry had a website called Shroud.com. Well, Joe Marino is now taking care of that. So just want to mention that you don't. And please, Alex, say hello to Joe Marino.
I ask a question? Sorry, got to turn on my mic. Near. I'd like to ask a question first. If you had put your shrub knowledge in a category of low, medium, and high, who would be a low? And who would be a medium? And who would be an high? Oh, wait. That's all. I'll be thankful. I've been studying the Shroud an extremely long time, and have seen many fallacious objections and misunderstandings about the Shroud. I would like to take this opportunity to try and clear some of them up. In no particular order, apart from addressing the C14 question early on, I will list an assertion and then a rebuttal. If you would like to do more research on any of the topics I mentioned, I suggest go to www.shroud.com and put any term you like into the search engine. It will search only shroud.com and not on the whole internet, so it's a very effective search engine. Barry started Shroud.com in 1996, so it'll be, 30 years old this year? My math is right. It's one of the oldest or most thorough sites on the internet. And just a fair warning, once you get there, you may end up spending hours, days, weeks, months, and years there. If you do that, don't forget to check in with your family periodically. You've been inundated with images and PowerPoint slides the whole conference, but I'm going to do this presentation as a rarity, that is, with no PowerPoint slides. Recently, a Shroud researcher who was actually here at the conference, Dr. Jeremiah Constant, had written me about a pastor who was skeptical about the Shroud and put his thoughts on paper and sent it to Dr. Johns, who forwarded it on to me. So we'll start with some of the objections that were expressed there. And then we'll move on to other misconceptions and objections in no particular order, just dealing with various things I've heard over the years. The pastor's first concern was that there was no mention of the image in the Gospels. While that is true, there may be a very good reason for that. The early church had something called the discipline of the secret, meaning some things had to be kept secret from the Romans and the Jews, so they had to be careful about what they said and what they wrote. One couldn't be too obvious about who or what was being criticized. For example, the book Revelation, where you see the term or place Babylon, that's referring to Rome. But in those days, if you were criticizing Rome, you wouldn't mention Rome if you valued your life. So Rome was called Babylon. If the Gospels had let on that there was an imaged shroud, the Romans or Jews might have sought out the cloth to destroy it. In addition, it's possible that the images on the shroud didn't appear for many decades after the resurrection. So maybe there were images to mention as the time the Gospel writers penned their Gospel. The pastor said that St. Paul would have mentioned the cloth as evidence of the resurrection. Well, Paul also would have been aware of the discipline of the secret. And there is one passage where many scholars believe he is referring to the shroud, which is Galatians 3:1, in which he wrote, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." That's an interesting phrase, publicly portrayed as such as like on a placard or that sort of thing. So that obviously that would the Galatians that Paul's writing in the late 50s, mid to late 50s, and if they're going to see for whose eyes Jesus was crucified, they would have needed a placard or maybe the shroud itself. The pastor said there is no historical record of the shroud before 1355. Well, I've written a 55-page article that mentions documented references to Jesus' burial and is covered from the 2nd century through the first half of the 14th century. And at that point, the shroud appears in the historical record in Barry in the first at 1355. Obviously, not every reference in my article is going to refer to the shroud, but it's very possible that some of them could. One of the speakers at this conference, Larry Stolley, has written a book over 600 pages looking at biblical passages that might possibly refer to the shroud. I encourage you to look for his book. It's available on Amazon. It's very expensive, though, I have to. The pastor said that in 1389, Bishop Pierre Darcis claimed the shroud was a forgery, stating he knew the artist. Well, the second part of that is completely wrong. It wasn't that bishop that said he knew the artist. He was referring to his immediate predecessor, who supposedly said that he knew who the artist was. And that bishop's name was Bishop Henri de Poitiers. And so that would have been around 1356. However, that bishop spoke very highly in a letter about the knight who wore the shroud, Geoffrey de Charny. Surely, if the claim about Bishop Henri knowing the artist had been true, the letter would not have been so glowing about Geoffrey de Charny. The pastor asked why Darcis would lie about it. He was upset that Geoffrey de Charny had gone over his head to request from Pope Clement VII permission to exhibit the shroud in another church in the diocese when Darcis's own church was badly in need of repairs. If de Charny was going to lose the opportunity to get donations, not the Charnys, if Darcis was going to lose the opportunity to get the donations for his church, that certainly could have been a reason to fabricate a story about the previous bishop and the supposed artist. The pastor replied to his own question of why Darcis would lie by stating, quote, "Some claim jealousy, but relics were big business during this time. A lie would turn tourism away," end quote. Well, if it were a lie, the people of Darcy's day likely wouldn't have even known, since about 34 years had passed since Bishop Henri's day. The pastor's response here is to a data point he had got completely wrong. And by the way, skeptics will often argue that because the 14th century had many fake relics, the shroud is a fake. Okay, that's just core logic. Just because there are fake 20 bills around doesn't mean that every $20 bill is a fake. A relic should be judged on its own merits, not on the period in which it's purportedly from. Pastor also wrote, a famous Tuscany artist named Jacopo del Casentino made a painting of St. John that resembles the head of the shroud. Well, I'm not saying that this continues to pull. I'm not saying Casentino was the artist, but that common representations of Christ were similar during the period. End quote. The common representation of Jesus looking like the shroud basically goes back to about the 6th century. So to focus in on, a painting in the 1380s is really nonsensical. One popular hypothesis is that a cloth known in history as the image of Edessa, which some believe to have been the shroud, in which possibly resurfaced after a flood there in about 525, became a model from which many artists based their representations of Jesus. The pastor's knowledge of art history is lacking here. The pastor stated that during the time the shroud surfaced in the 1350s, Roger Bacon's work on optics, light, and mirrors became known. The pastor claimed that it led to, quote, early photographic processing. But photography wasn't invented until 1799. And just because there was an advance in knowledge about optics, light, and mirrors doesn't automatically mean that that's how the shroud was formed. The Shroud of Turin, which Barry was a part of, he was the documenting photographer. They did a hands-on study of the shroud in 1978. They had 5 days around the clock to study the shroud. They examined multiple forgery hypotheses over the several years, and none were able to duplicate all the characteristics of the shroud. And to this day, nobody's been able to duplicate all of the characteristics. The pastor asserted that regarding the C14 test, which produced a date of 1260 to 1390, which would make it obviously too late to be Jesus. He says, quote, most scientists still stand upon the original testing, end quote. There has been much criticism of the C14 results, which include multiple scientific peer-reviewed journal articles. Some of you may know that I've written a 800-page book documenting some rather shoddy scientific work on the dating test. That word shoddy was actually used by 2 different C14 scientists who actually accepted the C14 results. And by the way, that 800-page book will be available as well as my first book, as well as the DVD. Besides the 800-page book, I've written a supplement accessible online with over 80 additional chronological entries. And recently I've added about a dozen articles about the related mess that the C14 labs did. And I have that on my academia page, and if you're interested in the URL of that, let me know after we talk. Since I'd taken over for Barry, I inherited about 80 boxes of archives from 4 or 5 different shroud researchers that the researchers themselves and their family passed on the archives to Barry, and then when Barry unfortunately died, they passed on to me. Boy, has it been fun going through those 8 boxes. C14 isn't infallible by any means, and given the shoddy nature of the shroud C14 dating, including the fact that only one sample site was chosen, which means one can't be sure that the sample was representative of the whole cloth. That was the whole idea behind the original protocol, taking possibly 3 samples, because you got to make sure that the samples you're taking are part of the original cloth. And they didn't do that, so we don't know to this day whether it was representative of the whole cloth. The experiments have shown that it probably obviously wasn't. Let's look at the C14 in a little more detail, since it's such an important aspect of the question. The first point to be kept in mind about C14 is that it, under certain circumstances, can be very unreliable. The method was only developed in the late 1940s, and despite refinements, it still has some limitations. Jacques Avant, a French C14 scientist who would accept the accuracy of the 1988 dating, wrote in a paper shortly before the dating, and listen to this quote. It is evident that the samples to be dated should contain carbon. However, the mere presence of this chemical element is not sufficient to produce a valid result. After many years of C14 dating, it has been shown that numerous results are in error or are erroneously interpreted, often because of lack of knowledge about the value of the material selected for dating. Okay, and so the material selected for the shroud dating is very dubious. It's interesting to note that in one record, quote, the original radiocarbon age obtained for one artifact was in error by almost 26,000 years. This was reported by a C14 scientist named D.E. Nelson in a journal article. C14 is used in archaeology as a confirmatory test to corroborate a hypothesized date that is arrived at on the basis of all the evidence pertaining to that object. In the case of the shroud, the C14 dating has to be judged in light of other scientific, medical, historical, and biblical knowledge. As archaeologist William Meacham stated, it would be one further piece of evidence to be evaluated in the light of the total complex of data about the shroud. It's just one discipline. Over 100 disciplines have studied the shroud. You can't take, the results from C14 and then just automatically throw out all the data from the other 100+ disciplines. W.G. Mook, another C14 scientist, echoed the quote, for relating radiocarbon dates with aid obtained by other independent physical dating methods, end quote. A specialist in the conservation of medieval paintings, Anna Hulbert of Oxfordshire, England, stated before the official results were released that the C14 dating indicated a medieval date. They would raise more problems for her than if the cloth dated 2,000 years old. Carbon dating, according to Hulbert, who had a particular interest in the history of medieval art technique, quote, like X-rays or any other analytical technique should be regarded as one tool among many. It is cheaply useful in the dating of undisturbed archaeological material, yet undisturbed, and the shroud has been on the surface for 700 years, so there was a lot of opportunity for contamination and problems. She continues, in the case of the shroud, one should calculate carefully whether any of its known wanderings or adventures, such as the 1532 buyer, could give a distorted reading to whatever date the radiocarbon laboratories came up with. And there was a Middle Eastern archaeologist named Eugene Nutowski who said, in any form of inquiry or scientific discipline, it is the weight of evidence which must be considered conclusive. In archaeology, if there are 10 lines of evidence, carbon dating being one of them, and it conflicts with the other 9, there is little hesitation to throw out the carbon date as inaccurate due to unforeseen contamination. The shroud should not be given less than standard procedure. In other words, she's saying in carbon dating, they often throw out dates because it doesn't match with all the other data, and sometimes they don't even know why the carbon dating was wrong, but they just throw it out. That did not happen in the case of the shroud. The problems with the shroud C14 dating started long before the current criticisms of the sample procedure and results surfaced. Even before the final results were announced, one C14 scientist believed that no matter what results would occur, there would be grounds for criticism. The late Dr. Garvin Harbottle sent me a letter in 1988, shortly before the dating, and he said, quote, no matter what date is obtained, there will be many skeptics or devout who will be disappointed. They already have at hand more than sufficient ammunition to attack any date they do not like. It was just so interesting that people who accepted the C-14 dating knew how shoddy it was. But I think there was a ego and image problem with, I don't think there was any way on earth they were going to come out and say, oh, I think we did wrong. The C-14 test was not rigorously done. I'm going to list real quickly 15 points of failure that was given by statistician Philippe Bourset de Carbon, which is spelled C-A-R-B-O-N, ironically. And then a symposium, he listed 15 points of failure, however rebuilt. 1, absence of a formal report of the sampling. 2, absence of a video archive on the final steps of the sample packaging. 3, in the official reports, contradictions about the cutting and the weight of the samples by people in charge of stamping. That one blows my mind. There were discrepancies about how thick the piece was and how much they weighed. I mean, that's a basic fact that you have to have. 4, breaches of the protocols initially planned for the operation of dating. 5, rejection of the usual procedure of double-blind tests. Double-blind means they wouldn't know which was the Shroud sample and they wouldn't know which was the control samples. 6, refusal of the interdisciplinary documentation, which is usual in procedures for radiocarbon dating. 7, exclusion of acknowledged specialists in the Shroud, particularly American scientists from SPERT that knew more about the Shroud than anybody on Earth. 8, communication to the laboratories, most unusual, of the dates of the control samples. You give control samples to the labs to make sure that the equipment is working properly. Okay? If you give the labs the control samples and you give them the dates, that enables you to do a little manipulation if you need to. Okay? 9, intercommunication of results among the 3 laboratories during the job. They weren't supposed to talk to one another. They exchanged phone calls and the like. 10, disclosure to the media of the first results before the delivering of the findings. 11, refusal to publish raw results of the measurements. That finally was taken into 2017. Tristan Casabianco, who was here at the conference, filed the Freedom of Information Act, and after, 29 years or something, they finally got the British Museum to release the raw data, which is normally released shortly after any scientific experiment. 12, non-explanation of the unique isolation of a competence interval of the measures performed by the Oxford laboratory compared to those made by the other laboratories. 13, unacceptable value of 6.4 published in the journal Nature for the chi-squared statistical test on the result of the radiocarbon dosage of the Shroud. If the samples are appropriate, you should get a value on the chi-square test of under 6.4, and they did get that with the Shroud. 14, rejection of any cross debate on the statistical measures performed. 15, rejection, absolutely uncommon, of the publication of the statistical expertise of this operation. As I mentioned, we finally got the raw data in 2017. Tristan and 3 others came out with a very impactful article in 2019 in Archaeometry. So this pastor I've been mentioning went so far as to say that he believed the Shroud was an art masterpiece. But since no one knows how the image was formed, one can't assume that it is art. At least if one allows for a world in which supernatural... All right, let's move on to other objections and misconceptions I've heard over the years. Some skeptics say that because the Gospel of John, at least in their English translation, mentioned linen strips, the Shroud is a fake. The Greek word aphonia is that's the Greek word in John that's is usually translated as linen strips. It's just a generic plural term that can include strips and other cloths, and a shroud, a full-length shroud, would fit within the definition of aphonia. And I always get a little upset when skeptics bring up the Gospel of John and they don't even mention the other three Gospels. It's like, are the other three not Gospels? You're just going to zero in on one? I think that's being intellectually dishonest. You have to look at all the evidence. I've never heard a skeptic who believes that the Gospel of John alone disproves the shroud mention that, well, Luke mentions Joseph of Arimathea had purchased fine linen to wrap the shroud in when he first mentions the burial cloth. That's the Greek word synda, which basically is the more specific term for shrouds. But at 24:12 in Luke, when he describes Peter and John going to the tomb, he uses the word aphonia, which John had used in his gospel. So Luke uses both the terms syndon and aphonia, where Matthew and Luke use syndonoli, John uses aphonia. Some skeptics say that the shroud can't be authentic because the Gospel of John mentions a headcloth and the shroud is only one piece. They don't consider the possibility that the headcloth and the shroud could have been separated, maybe over 2,000 years. In fact, it was probably inevitable that they would have gotten separated. The headcloth is believed to be what is known as the Shroud of Oviedo, or the Ciborium of Oviedo. There's been several talks about that during this conference, for which there is documentation going back to the 7th century. And like the shroud, it's been intensely studied by scientists and researchers. And if that cloth is authentic and it wrapped the same man, that means it would have to be at least going back to about 614, and that would put carbon dating off right there by 700 years. Some skeptics say that because 1 Corinthians 11:14 says that a shameful of men had long hair, the shroud can't be Jesus because the man in the shroud has long hair. Well, long is a relative term to start with. Similar to the controversy about the linen strips, the objection made is based on a simplistic interpretation of the verse. It's likely referring to the practice of men adorning their hair in the style of women rather than the normal men's style of that day. And we know from even the Old Testament, many Jews had long hair, so that is not a problem. Some skeptics claim that the man in the shroud can't be Jesus because he has a beard and Jesus' beard was plucked out. Well, the whole beard would not have been plucked out. That would have taken too long for one thing, and you don't pluck out a full beard. There's a gap in the beard. They may have plucked down a little bit of it, but they're not going to pluck out the whole beard. Skeptics claim that Sturt was nothing but a group of pseudo-scientific religious fanatics out to prove the resurrection. While there were a few devout Catholics and evangelicals on the team, the religious affiliations of most of the team members weren't even known by Barry Schwartz. Regarding their scientific expertise, most of the members worked in the U.S.'s space and nuclear programs. So these were pretty brilliant guys. I think they would have been bright enough to figure out if somebody had painted it or done it some other manner. And their main task going over to Turin was to figure out how the image got on there. And they failed in that mission. They didn't know how it got on there. Skeptics claim that the shroud is a forgery, even though dozens of prominent doctors and surgeons, and we had one in the back of the room, we got Dr. Lavoie, who has been studying the shroud for how many years, Gil? Over 40. And these, medical doctors and surgeons are pretty bright people too, I think. And most of those have been saying that it's anatomically and physiologically correct, We had Dr. Buckland and Dr. Zugaby, both deceased now, that did between them about 50,000 autopsies between them. And they believed that there was a real crucified man in the shroud. Skeptics often accuse Christian scientists or Christian researchers of being biased if they believe the shroud is authentic. But why are agnostics or atheists who believe the shroud to be a forgery any less biased than a Christian researcher who thinks it's authentic? Only a few skeptics from 1973 to 1978 examined the shroud directly. Most of the skeptics that pronounce on the shroud had not really done much research. And for perhaps, speaking of medicine, perhaps a medical analogy would be helpful here. Suppose I go to a doctor for an issue. They examine me directly, do tests, and write up their conclusions. Then there's another doctor who hears about my case. They don't examine me directly, but just read about the findings of the first doctor. The second doctor comes out with a completely different diagnosis than the first. How many people in that situation would accept the conclusions of the second doctor over the findings of the first? The answer is obvious, not many would. Some skeptics claim they can reproduce a convincing reproduction of the shroud using materials available in the 13th to 14th centuries. Well, the materials to build an airplane existed back then, but nobody built an airplane. Okay? There wasn't the scientific know-how to do that. If a forger was trying to make an image to fool the largest number of people, why would he have made it so difficult to see with the naked eye? I mean, if you can see it the best between about 6 and 10 feet. If you get closer to 6, you really can't see the image. If you get further away than 10, it's a little difficult to see as well. So an artist coming up with an image like that to fool people really just doesn't make sense logically. Skeptics claim that since God had commanded no graven images, the shroud should be discounted. The answer to this is simple. The Shroud of Turin research project concluded in 1981 that the images were not the product of an artist. If that's the case, it's miraculous and not made by the hand of man, so it cannot be a graven image. Some Christian skeptics saying that the shroud is a distraction that takes people away from the core gospel message. But if the shroud helps bring people to the gospel message, why should anyone complain? Christianity is a historic religion. Jesus was wrapped in a shroud. It says so in the Gospels. It's not unlikely that the Christian community would have preserved it. It's not unlikely that God could use it to draw people to him and has providentially helped preserve it down to our day. The Apostle Thomas needed more than testimony of his fellow apostles to believe that the shroud had risen. When Thomas finally saw him for himself, Jesus didn't banish him for the 12 because he had not believed. And for those who get hung up on the fact that the image is not mentioned in the Gospels, which we already addressed, don't forget that the final verse of the Gospel of John says, there are still many other things that Jesus did, yet if they were written about in detail, I doubt there would be room enough in the entire world to hold the books to record them. Might not leaving an image shroud be one of those things? Skeptics claim that the fingers and arms are too long. Some scientists say that the image has some qualities of an X-ray, so what we could be seeing in the hands are the finger bones, which would make the fingers appear longer than they actually are. The right shoulder seems to be dislocated, which would make that arm appear to be longer than it actually was. Skeptics claim that the blood is too red. Old blood always obviously turns brown or black. But it's been discovered that if someone is tortured severely, the liver produces an enzyme called bilirubin, which keeps the blood red. That's one explanation. Barry used to joke, bilirubin is not a Jewish guy in New York. Some skeptics say, even if the shroud wrapped a real being, how do we know it's Jesus and not some other victim? First of all, how many fully intact burial shrouds are you aware of? I think we only got one. Secondly, how many crucified victims in history are you aware that had a cap of thorns, was severely scourged, had a lance wound in the side, and did not have his legs broken? Again, I think we're looking at one. And a lot of the scientific evidence seems to be pointing to the fact that the image was caused by the resurrection. And again, we only have one of those. Okay, here's a few more misconceptions. The shroud image was likely painted on. As mentioned in the STURP summaries, the scientists found no paint on the shroud. A transmitted light was placed behind the shroud, and while the blood showed up, the image did not, which tells you that there was no paint, or for that matter, any foreign substance to cause the image. Another misconception. Iron oxide was used with the blood. Heller and Adler of STURP performed 12 different tests that showed that there was real blood on the shroud. As Adler used to like to say, it's blood, B-L-U-E, blood. There's a big misconception about the VPA image analyzer. It's usually stated that it was invented by NASA. It was not invented by NASA. It was developed by a private company. That used to make Barry bad, because somebody said that in the late 1970s and kept getting repeated, and it came to be known as a fact when it was wrong in the first place. Some people claim that Ray Rogers was an atheist. He was actually Episcopalian, but he stopped going to church when he was very ill, so he was not an atheist. A big one is people say that the shroud images show the wrist wound exiting in the wrist, and people you see art, all the time shows the nail through the palm, and that isn't correct anatomically because the weight of the body it would rip through. Now, probably did go, we can't see the palm side because the hands are like this. The nail probably went through the lower part of the palm and then came out on the wrist side. That were hold the body. Because the man in the shroud had a broken nose, that contradicts the messianic prophecy, now that bone shall be broken. That's another misconception. The nose where it was broken is actually cartilage and not bone, so that prophecy is still intact. I've heard the claim that the shroud can't be authentic because a shroud from that period couldn't last that long. That's nonsense. If you go to the Turin Egyptian Museum, is the second biggest in the world after the one in Cairo, and they have claws there that are 5,000 years old. I went to a lecture once, and a guy had a small piece of an Egyptian linen that was 4,000 years old. Linen can last; it's not a problem, especially if it's taken good care of. Now, another misconception is that in the invisible reweave theory that my late wife and I put forth, it's usually stated that the nuns, the poor Clare nuns who repaired the shroud in 1534 after the 1532 fire, that they performed the invisible reweave. And Sue and I didn't believe that they did it. it would have been too complicated a task. They could do the simple patches that they put in for the fire, but Margaret of Austria owned the shroud at the time, and she had access to the French weavers in her court, and they definitely would have been talented enough to do it. So we believe that Margaret of Austria's weavers performed the invisible reweave and not the poor clairnuns. I have a few questions that I would like to ask skeptics. We don't have in here, but if I come across them, I'll have this sheet with me and ask them. For those who say the shroud doesn't match to the Bible, how would a Christian in, say, 200 AD, before the New Testament was compiled, have determined that the shroud was authentic? There was no official Bible at that time. Have you read the New Testament in the original Koine Greek language, or have you relied only on English translations? How much reading have you done in the area of biblical exegesis? Did you know that many Protestant and Catholic clergy with years of seminary training and with various degrees believe the shroud could be authentic? Are you aware that the Sudario of Oviedo, which has been in Spain since 614 AD and is believed by many scholars to be the napkin mentioned in John 20, verses 6 and 7? Did you know that by the 1st century, even the Egyptians had stopped wrapping their dead in the mummy style? Have you ever thought to question Jewish rabbis about the known Jewish burial customs of the 1st century, or read a book about them? Are you aware of a book, for example, by the late archaeologist Rachel Hakili, titled Jewish Funerary Customs, Practices, and Rites in the Second Temple Period, which is about 600 pages? Not sure I want to read the whole thing. Have you ever done any research into art history, which suggests that paintings of Jesus that have come down to us may well have derived from the existence of the shroud? Are you aware of the dozens, probably hundreds, of medical doctors and surgeons who believe that the shroud images and blood are correct anatomically and physiologically? How many books or peer-reviewed papers on the shroud have you read? How familiar are you with the numerous peer-reviewed journals in which papers on the shroud have been published? Are you aware that the shroud is likely the most intensely studied artifact in human history, and that no one knows how the image got on the cloth? How much expertise do you have in all these disciplines needed to create such an image? I'm going to encourage you. I got the summary statement from Stern, which I alluded to, but I think rather than read it, I'll suggest if you go to shroud.com and there's a link directly to it. It's called Stern Summary Statement or something to that effect. It's well worth reading. It was written in 1981, and they concluded that it was not the product of an artist, but it's well worth reading. It's all in there, and I'll open it up for questions.
Yes, so one of the field words are important. Which version of the Bible English will you recommend as the most accurate representation of Greek or Aramaic?
Joe, repeat the question if you were sounding bizarre.
The question was, what is the most accurate English language translation for the Greek? I used to use the New Jerusalem Bible, and another one is the Revised Standard version. It was a too much.
Well, first I want to say thank you to such a great presentation on all those, misconceptions in your answers. And I just wanted to know if I had this right. I was trying to understand, this is kind of what the previous speaker was talking about, is a carbide. But from my understanding, it sounds like if the person accepts that the image was made by radiation, that process adds nitrogen to the cloth, and then when you did carbon testing, that would make the cloth seem younger. Did I get that right?
Yeah, there's a school of thought that radiation not only caused the image, but skewed a C14A, and so the hand goes It's at Lauderhands with the invisible reading. Bob Rucker hips, Glenn's and that one of day. And we're still friends, even though with the
Joe, for those who may not be familiar, you mentioned the reweave. Could you explain what that is and how it might have affected the carbon-14 testing?
Okay. In the C14 quarter, which if you look at what's called a quad mosaic, you can see it's a dark green, and the main part of the cloth is sort of like orange and red. And different colors indicate different chemical composition. And it's clear from the quad mosaics that the C14 corner is different chemically than the main part of the shroud. So they took the sample from the lower front corner in the shroud where a piece had been taken out for relics, and they just cut the 1 inch by 7 centimeter inch piece. You divided it up into threes, actually by 5 pieces. They gave 2 to Arizona, 1 to Oxford, 1 to Zurich, and they kept the piece. And my wife and I believe that they actually repaired that quarter. And at first we thought it was like a piece of 16th century cloth put up against a piece of first century cloth. But later, Ray Rogers, when he looked at our ferry, started looking at samples, found what he calls spliced red. In other words, it had cotton and linen twisted together, and then had a dye and a gun to keep it together. Because cotton is easier to dye than linen. So he thought we were crazy at first. I mean, he called us Barry to cringe, and then he called Barry back up. He chastised Barry for publishing on paper, and he calling Barry back up, and he said, "I can't believe it. I think they're right."
Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Joe Marino, thank you so much. With a short break in the top of the hour, Rusty will be joining us again. Secrets of the Shroud.